Last time, on Merid and Karen, Eugene Paul Clausen was convicted of the murders 6 years after the girls disappeared. The West Virginia Supreme Court overturned the conviction, finding that prosecutors biased the jury with horrific photographs and false statements to the press. Clausen went back to trial and was convicted again, despite contradictory testimony and a lack of physical evidence. Now, 5 months after our last episode aired, we flash forward to 2006, when a new investigation takes place, and we discover that the case affected those involved so strongly that they could not let it go. All of this leading up to the final episode of Merid and Karen, in which we'll hear the horrifying story of the man Jeff believes is the murderer. Can he convince Sarah? But first, an answer for those of you who are wondering where the case stands now. As always, listener discretion is advised. From Chromatic Media in the heart of Morgantown, West Virginia, this is Merid and Karen, the WVU Coed murders. We've already made the case for Clausen's innocence and shown how authorities should probably have been able to determine this before the trial during his many conflicting confessions.
Him being in the interrogation room is a prime example where he doesn't know the answers. He can't give the answers.
This is Valina Beatty. She's a professor of law at WVU, where she also heads the West Virginia Innocence Project.
He tries to divert to something else. Or again, he's just responding with what he thinks they want him to say. When a prosecutor says, oh, the defendant knew facts that no one else could know and facts that aren't made public. Well, that's often because the police fed those facts. And police don't even know that they're necessarily doing that. That's what's been really fascinating over the past 10 years, looking at false confessions in wrongful conviction cases, because we know they're false confessions, is that you go back and you look at the recorded interrogation, and that's where even the police officer himself can see, oh my gosh, I was the one giving that information to the defendant. He wasn't giving it to me, I was giving it to him.
I know we're talking about the decapitation deaths of 2 teenagers, but the shit you're talking about, that is really scary to me.
Yeah.
The West Virginia Innocence Project is the state chapter of a nationwide network of volunteers and legal professionals who attempt to overturn wrongful convictions, which can happen for a number of reasons.
Leading causes of wrongful conviction include faulty eyewitness identifications, so mistaken identification, false confessions, just like here, actually pretty prominent. Faulty forensic evidence, so false scientific evidence being introduced at trial, which also happened here. Snitches, so snitch testimony by someone who stands to gain something from the prosecution for the case. That is a contributor to wrongful convictions. Prosecutors not disclosing evidence, which we would call Brady evidence. So prosecutors' lack of disclosure is also another contributing cause. And oftentimes these come together. So there's a couple of them that will play off of each other. So if you have a false confession, maybe the confession doesn't look that reliable. But once you also have this scientific evidence of hair.
She's using air quotes here around scientific evidence.
That confirms the confession or confirms the case, then those combined together can lead to the wrongful conviction.
As one example of the kind of work the Innocence Project takes on in West Virginia, briefly consider the case of Joseph Buffy.
Joseph Buffy in Clarksburg, West Virginia, was arrested and charged with breaking into the home of an elderly woman and raping her. The victim was the mother of a police officer, so the police took the crime very seriously. And she also remembered the encounter, was able to speak to the encounter, was recorded in her description of the encounter, always said it was a single perpetrator, and had specific details about the perpetrator. Joseph Buffy was arrested. He had committed some small burglaries nearby, Salvation Army, getting a few toys, frankly. And he was brought in for this case and interrogated. And after many hours, early in the morning, 3 or 4 a.m., he finally said, okay, yes, I committed this crime, and started agreeing with what the police were saying. This is a prime example of the police feeding facts to an individual. So the police would say, okay, how did you enter the house? Joseph Buffy would say, oh, I entered through the door. He'd say, oh, do you mean the window? Oh, yeah, the window. So where did you assault her? Oh, downstairs. You mean upstairs? What weapon did you use? Well, you actually know you used this weapon. The police kept feeding facts to him, so he knew what to say. He knew what to parrot back. DNA testing results came back, showed it wasn't him. It was actually someone else. So not only did it prove that it wasn't Joseph Buffy, it actually determined who the true perpetrator was, and the prosecutors said, no, you already pled guilty. We're completely opposing your motion to take back your guilty plea. You made that choice yourself. You're stuck with it. It frankly doesn't matter whether you're innocent or guilty.
Clausen's case is obviously different in some ways, but what's similar is that both Clausen and Buffy decide at some point to convince the police that they're guilty, though for very different reasons. When Clausen recanted his confessions, he told authorities that, in a way, he had been fed information by the police in much the same way. Now, if ever there was an unreliable source of information, it's Clausen, but consider his story, if only as another hypothetical example of how this works. When investigators first went up to New Jersey and drove Clausen back to Morgantown, they ended up coming south along Willie Street, on which Merritt and Karen had hitchhiked the night they disappeared. The investigators asked Clausen to show them where he had picked up the girls. Right here, he eventually said, but he was wrong. They hadn't gotten far enough. And Clausen said he could tell from the reactions of the officers that this was the wrong answer. So he said, well, maybe not. When the car finally arrived where the police believed the girls to have been picked up, one of them said, was it here? Clausen said he took this as his cue and said that it was. But there was another problem with that. The investigators were wrong. Remember that this was 6 years after the murders, so neither of the officers had actually been working the case when it was fresh, so they had the wrong spot. Valina first heard about the Coed case from George Castell, who appeared in episode 6. He was the lawyer who wrote a case summary for the West Virginia Supreme Court after the first trial about why Clausen's conviction should be overturned. He told us this.
This case needs to be re-examined, especially as forensic science developed. I mean, today, not just today, but a decade ago, when Clausen was still alive, we could have subjected the hair in this case to mitochondrial DNA testing. So I periodically recommended to Morgantown lawyers that somebody should make the effort to see if the hair has been saved.
Valina was one of those Morgantown lawyers. Not long afterward, she was approached by Patrick Buzzini, who used to teach forensic science at WVU.
So we met up and talked about the Coed murders. And he told me that he believed there was pubic hair that was available. He had become interested in, is there a way to test this evidence? I was fascinated by this because there can't be an active case. There can't be a live case for Eugene Clausen. Because he's passed away, there's not standing to be able to bring a claim that he was wrongfully convicted, because the court would just say, this is moot. There's not someone who's affected by this, and there's not someone who has standing. But if the hair samples that were picked up from the bird's nest or whatever, if those are still around, okay, there can be some potential comparison of its characteristics, but there's not a root. But if there are actually these pubic hairs, those have a root. Actually, Patrick Buzzini sent me a picture of it saying, here's a picture of the hair with the root.
Gross.
Yeah, well, I'm used to that, right? So I'm like, that's awesome.
As a woman.
No. So if that actually exists, then they really could look at the DNA of it and see. And Patrick wasn't able to get the hair because the trooper says, this evidence was already forensically tested. This isn't going to be helpful to you. Okay, now remember, what the lab did was in the 1970s.
It was someone looking at hair under a microscope and saying, it's this color. Next.
There you go. Then he says, the prosecution says you have to file a motion for it, which we can't do. We never get a clear answer about whether the evidence is there. The only answer we get is that they're not going to turn it over.
That hair is like the white whale right now.
I know. But it really could be there. It could be right here in Morgantown, right next to the soccer field. Like, that's where their outpost is.
So what would you say to people who suggest that Clausen is not worth fighting for because he was guilty of some pretty heinous stuff?
The system should be held accountable for failing and should really focus on what led to wrongful conviction so that we can stop them from happening in the future. So that's one benefit of finding out about a wrongful conviction. But wow, I mean, doesn't the family deserve to know that someone else actually committed this crime? Doesn't the community deserve to know for their safety? I mean, it would have been great if someone had found this out 30 years ago and been able to get the true perpetrator at that point. So I think it's important to investigate wrongful convictions for the safety of our community, for the reliability of our system, and really also just for the victims' families.
Even at this later date, I mean, there's not much we can do for the women of 1970, but maybe on a system-wide idea.
Well, yeah, and I absolutely think that, I was just saying this, I think that your podcast does that it's able to highlight someone who I think likely was wrongfully convicted and why that happens. How can that happen? Everyone wants to find the true perpetrator. The police want to catch the true perpetrator. The prosecutors want to prosecute the true perpetrator. So how does it happen that an innocent man ends up being caught up in this?
Even 6 years later.
Yeah, oh my gosh. Yeah, right, exactly.
To finish the last 2 episodes of this show, we go back to Jeff's introduction in episode 1, when we learned that he was brought into the investigation of Meriden Karen by a retired state trooper named Richard Hall, who was attending a writing class that Jeff was teaching.
The course he came to was on how to write a nonfiction book. He was just some guy. The people in the course tended to be in their 50s, 60s, 70s, because that's when people get time to write, and they go, I've always wanted to write. So anyway, he's just some guy.
Can you back up? Can you just describe him a bit for us?
Yeah, Richard was a tall guy. He was a couple inches taller than me, so he's maybe 6'3", 6'4", very dignified, self-possessed, kind of an erect, semi-military bearing. And he wore jeans and a T-shirt or something like that. I mean, he's a casual dresser. He had been in the state police. He retired as a lieutenant colonel, the third highest ranking guy in the state police. And he, after I think 30 years in the state police, before that he'd been in the Marines, and before that he worked driving railroad spikes. So he was, he had a long, healthy life, and so he was a very vigorous guy. And he came to me at the end of class one day, his first or second class, and he said, I had said I was from Morgantown, and he said, "You're from Morgantown, you know about the Coed murders up there?" And I said, "Oh yeah," and I talked a little bit about them, and then he said, "Well, I testified in the trial in '76 in Morgantown," and I said, "Well, I must have seen you there because I was at the trial. I attended parts of it, and so I must have seen you. But,
I was the guy with the porn stash.
yeah, I was the 15-year-old who people go, aren't you supposed to be in school?
Richard Hall has appeared sporadically throughout the story already. He was the investigator who had been sent by the state police to question Clausen before his first trial.
As an interrogator, trained that way, he knew that people whose stories are really vague in general or way too specifics, either one of those are likely to be lying. It was all vague. He couldn't come up with any. He didn't supply any information. So Richard came away saying, he's lying. This is nonsense.
But the confession itself also made Hall suspect Clausen's innocence. He would eventually tell Jeff,
there's no way they did all that in the back of a car. Because Clausen had detailed this extraordinary confession that involved a lot of sexual gymnastics. And
This was like letter to the editor of Hustler.
yeah, it was more like, it sounded more like that than anything real when you read the confession. He had, in fact, tried to tell people, this guy didn't do this. He's just full of it. He's confessing for some reason.
After the brief conversation about how they both attended the trial, Jeff and Hall didn't talk much in the class. It ended after a few weeks and they went their separate ways. That was January of 2006.
In June, I get a call from him, and I don't know how he found my phone number or anything, but he said he had my phone number. He called me, and he said, could we meet this week? I want to talk to you about something. And I said, sure. And I was about to give him direction. He said, okay, I'll be at your place. We said Friday, and he said, okay, I'll be there a little afternoon. And that was it. He already clearly knew where I was. And that...
So you'd never given him your address or your phone number?
I'd never given my address or anything. So he obviously had some kind of... Well, I don't know how he found out. He could have checked.
He could have been going through your trash.
He could have been, but I really doubt that.
Not long after receiving the phone call, Hall did stop by.
He comes and, he's there and he's got a briefcase with him, and it was very hot that day, and he's in jeans and a t-shirt, and he's, I invite him in, and we sit down at the dining room table, and he puts his briefcase there, and he opens it up, and he pulls out some files, thick files, and says, I would like you to take a look at these, and I would like you to help with this investigation. I said, well, okay, I'll look through them. And he said, I know who did it.
At the time, Hall suspected that Castellanos, the dentist from episode 4, was the murderer.
He was saying that to me as a way of hooking me into the investigation, which it definitely did that. As soon as he said that, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to read these things, because I've been wondering about that since I was a kid. As had lots of people in Morgantown.
So you realize that 10 years later, you used the same hook on me.
I did?
You said, I know who did it. Do you want to know who did it?
Yeah, well, I probably was just, I didn't realize I did that, but I probably was just imitating Richard and thinking, well, it worked on me. It hooked me into it, so maybe it'll work on Sarah.
As the case unfolded in 1976, a rift began to develop in law enforcement between people like Richard Hall and other law enforcement officers who believed Clausen was guilty. Hall may have just had more experience and training, or he may have just been more perceptive in general. Whatever the reason, the opposing viewpoints sometimes caused a great deal of tension.
Richard's up there in Elkins for the trial, and there are other officers up there who are going to be testifying. The story that I heard from Richard was that they were having a dinner, and Richard was the only one of the four who didn't believe Clausen did it. The other three firmly believed Clausen did it, and that tensions rose, and he said it got to the point where we were all four standing and shouting at each other in the middle of this restaurant. And he said, I thought there was going to be a fight.
One of those troopers was Trooper Don Shade. His name and his story are right out of a cop show.
Shade was one of the guys that drove Clausen back and forth from Camden a couple times.
So he'd had a lot of experience with Clausen in person.
Yes.
And he still thought at that point that Clausen was responsible.
Yes. At one point in the coming back from Camden, Clausen said, I got to piss. And said, well, we'll just stop the car and you jump out and go. And Clausen said, no, he'll shoot me.
He meant Shade. Shade would shoot him. So he was afraid of Shade.
Oh, yeah, he was very afraid of Shade.
Trooper Shade was my second cousin. Him and my mom were first cousins. Their dads were brothers.
This is Vanessa Lawson.
He would come to visit my mom and dad, a couple times a year. We would always all get together and just sit and talk. Donnie was a really nice man. I mean, he had a lot of personal issues. He was an undercover cop for over 5 years, and that really messed him up a lot.
Shade wasn't just an undercover officer for 5 to 6 years, he was undercover with a single biker gang for that long. We now know the potentially destructive psychological effects of this kind of work. It creates tremendous internal conflict, an eroding sense of personal identity, and a deterioration of psychological and behavioral norms. Research shows that even the most ethical officers can succumb or be forced to succumb to the subculture they're participating in.
Of course, he had to use to be in with them, and that's when his life took a turn for the worse. I mean, he had let his hair grow long. My mom didn't even know him. He stopped at the house one day, and she told my dad, she goes, must be friends of yours. Get the gun. I don't know who these people are. That's how unrecognizable he was. And he had gotten into a lot of bad stuff, and that really messed him up. But he was, from other people I've talked to, a lot of people didn't like him, but a lot of people really respected him too. He was kind of cocky. He walked around proud of who he was, what he had accomplished. But like I said, the family was proud of him, of course, for what he had done. He became a trooper. But like I said, there were times too that I know the job was hard on him.
You didn't find out he had a second family or anything, did you?
Sarah is half joking when she asks this, but across the table, Vanessa slowly nods her head yes.
Really?
Yeah, he was married before and had 3 children. And then he married again and had 2 children. And when he was a trooper in Princeton, apparently he had a son. And he and I are friends on Facebook, his son. He seems like a really nice guy, and he looks like his dad a lot.
It turns out that despite the fights that Hall and Shade got into decades ago, they turned out quite similar. Like Jeff, like Richard Hall, like many others we've spoken to, the case never stopped tugging at the back of his mind.
So at one point we learned that Shade actually starts his own investigation.
Yeah. He learned, he's in somewhere in the early 2000s. By that point, he had become convinced that Clausen, not only that Clausen didn't do it, but that he knew who did.
One time he was visiting at my mom and dad's, and they were just sitting around talking about stuff, and I said to him, Donnie, I said, did they ever find out who had killed those Coeds? And the only thing he said to me was, they found the bodies but never found the heads. And I said to him, you have any idea where those would be? And he said, no idea. But I said, well, who was the man that they arrested? And he told me a Clausen. But he said he's not the one that did it. He said a gentleman by the last name of Williams is the one that supposedly did the killing.
So did he ever talk about maybe thinking that Clausen was guilty at one time?
Never did.
No? Did he elaborate at all on this Williams?
No, he didn't. And I never at the time thought to say, well, what's his first name? Where's he from? Now I'm more interested than ever. After all of this, I'm really interested in it. He was sure that the last name was Williams. He said Mr. Clausen did not do this. He just didn't want to give up. He knew who the man was, this Williams, but he just couldn't give it up. He died in October of 2003.
So for about 20 years.
Yes.
Neither Jeff nor Sarah have any idea who this Williams might be. Shade's notes about his later investigation supposedly still exist and are in the possession of his son, who, incidentally, is also named Jeff.
Mom said, Jeff's going to come to visit. And I was like, really? And she was like, yes. And I said, ask him about those notes. I said, nobody wants to keep them. They just want to look at them. He can have them back. And she was like, okay, I'll see what I can do. And I'm thinking, well, just let me know when he's going to be there.
Yeah.
I'll come and talk to him.
We'll look at them under glass. We won't even touch them.
Yeah, we
To date, we have not been able to see the notes.
Time of the evening, I pull out my gun, prepared for what's after. I pour something strong. I yearn for the rope and lady's sweet voice to sing me my last words. I won't sing alone. Needle fall down, sing me a song. Yeah, it's been a long life and it all went wrong. Needle fall down, sing me a song. It's been a long life and it all went wrong.
As we've mentioned, the person Hall suspected at this time was Elias Castellanos, Karen's dentist, who we talked about at the beginning of episode 4, Parade of Horribles. And as Jeff was just learning the intimate details of this case, he was also trying to decide whether he should invest the kind of effort it would require.
So one of the things I wanted to find out before I committed to being involved in this was, is it worth my time? I'm really curious about it, but does anyone else even think of the case? And so I went to Morgantown, and I had a few days there, and one morning it was kind of a bright, sunshiny day, and it wasn't too hot, and I said, well, I think I'll go take that tour of Morgantown, there was a walking tour of Morgantown where you, at the time, it's on a little cassette thing and you wear headphones and stuff. Now it's probably web-based. So one of my first stops was at Citizens Bank, which is where I bank, and there's a friend of mine who is a teller there, Mary Beth, and Mary Beth was there, and there wasn't anybody in line or anything, so we had a few minutes on how you been, and small chit chat. And I said, "Oh, I'm up in Morgantown. I'm looking to write a nonfiction book about Morgantown, some kind of, I don't know what exactly, but I just wanted to ask you." And the question popped into my head at that point, and I thought, what were the three most significant things that you remember growing up in Morgantown from the late 60s through the 70s, somewhere in that period? What were the three most significant things you remember? And the first thing she mentioned was the Coed murders. And she said she was so scared, and everyone was scared at the time, and she was so scared that she was at 4-H camp that summer, and she refused to sleep in her tent. She was only sleeping in her older sister's tent because the bodies had been found about a half a mile away. So I thought, well, okay, that's my question. So I asked people, and I don't remember, I asked 9 or 10 or 15 or something people, but I do remember all but 2 of them brought up the Coed murders.
So you didn't ask anyone that you didn't know?
No.
You never came across a stranger and asked them this random question? No,
and because the next thing you know, you're going to say, could I have $1? And, that's not well received.
The reason that I ask you is because that's what Kendall and I did. We went and we asked a bunch of strangers, hey, do you remember when these 2 teen girls got their head cut off?
Yeah, but I know a lot of people in all sorts of different areas.
We get it, Jeff. You're fucking popular.
I've been here a long time.
Okay.
So one of the people I asked was a former landlord of mine. So I asked him same question, and he mentioned the Coed murders, but he also mentioned another thing, that I think he said his wife might have a different thing to say because she had been mishandled or molested, or it's not clear, in a dentist chair. And I said, oh, really? And he said, yeah, Dr. Castellanos.
So his number one suspect you encountered randomly on the street. So how did that make you feel?
It made me feel that when that happened, I thought, well, maybe there's something to Richard's idea. One of the people I started asking people, have you ever gone to Dr. Castellanos? And one of the people, my sister, said, oh yeah, that guy, he's creepy. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, I was going to have a procedure there. She was a teenager, I think 16 or 17. And she just got nervous and left. I mean, she said, no, I've changed my mind. My sister's pretty intuitive, so I don't know what tipped her off, but she said that. And so I think, well, there must have been something there that she was picking up on.
Hall placed an ad in the Dominion Post asking for information from anyone who had shady experiences with dentists in Morgantown. Hoppy Kercheval, the talk show host we interviewed last episode, saw that ad and called Richard Hall up to invite him onto the show. Here are excerpts from that 2006 interview.
There's a former West Virginia state trooper, a retired state trooper, Richard Hall, who worked on the case initially and who listened to Clausen's confession, who doesn't think that Clausen did it. And now he's looking back into the case. Richard Hall joins us this morning. Richard, how are you?
Good morning. Fine. Thank you.
Thanks for coming on. Why do you think that Clausen did not commit this crime?
He was at work in a lumber company just north of Philadelphia the day of the crime, and the day before the crime, and the day after. And not one part of his confession could be corroborated. Really, it was a social verdict.
What do you mean a social verdict?
Well, the case was so heinous, the prosecution, if they had got a not guilty verdict, their political career would have took a nosedive. And the defense attorneys the same way. Their law practice would have been damaged if they'd got a not guilty verdict. And those 12 jurors, I feel sorry for them. They didn't hear the story. They only heard Clausen's confession, which was uncorroborated. And their neighbors would have probably ostracized them for finding him not guilty.
So you're saying that you don't think there was any physical evidence that conclusively linked Clausen to the murders beyond the confession?
There is nothing. Nothing was proven. He was convicted on his statement alone.
Now, why are you interested in this? Again, this has been 36 years since the crime was committed. It's 30 years since the first trial. You listened to his first confession, but why are you now suddenly reinterested in this case?
Well, because there's a killer out there somewhere walking the streets, and Clausen's doing his time, but Clausen remains in jail. He needs to belong there. He's a pedophile, a predator, and should remain in prison the rest of his life. He's a threat to society, and I'm not doing this to help Clausen. Mm-hmm. I just want to see the killer caught, and it would be a bonus if we could locate the heads and get them with the rest of the body. And also, the father of one of the Coeds is a friend, Richard Farrell.
Richard Farrell was a friend of yours?
Yes.
Clausen today is at Mount Olive at the state prison. You went to see him a couple weeks ago. Tell me about that meeting, and what did you ask him, and what did he tell you?
Oh, he still denies he didn't do it. And
he denies he did it.
Oh, yes.
He denies he did it.
Yeah.
Still.
And he's 65 years old now, walks with a cane, has a liver disease, and hinted that it's HIV, AIDS, and he dreams of getting out of prison. He's going to have a little place in the country with a dog. And he would be a threat to society no matter where he is. He told me off the record that he assaulted a young boy once who he encouraged to help him carry a six-pack of beer down under a railroad bridge. And he was walking on crutches because of an injury, and he attacked the boy with the crutches.
Oh, he committed sex crimes on children. I mean, he's a deviant character.
Right. He's got a page and a half rap sheet.
Yeah.
He belongs right where he is.
But you're not. But despite that, you still don't believe he did it.
No, he didn't do it. No way he could have done it.
Do you think, how confident are you that in the months ahead that you'll come up with the person that you think really did it and identify them to authorities as a suspect? I mean, it's been years. You got evidence gone. You got witnesses gone. You got memories faded. What are the odds?
Yeah, the odds are not very good, really. But at least I'm going to try. And there's people out there. There's somebody out there can help me. And if they just come forward, we can get it done.
Between Hall's newspaper ad and radio appearance, he got plenty of calls from people with sketchy experiences with dentists, as we heard.
But at the same time, other people called him. So he got a call from a woman who had found a machete on her land back when she was a kid, and about a mile from where the Coed's bodies were found.
So she found this as a kid and she's only bringing it up now?
She took it back to her mother, who said thank you and put it in the attic. And I've never understood that. And when you're doing this kind of thing, you find out all kinds of stuff and you go, why did that person do that? And I brought that up to Richard and he goes, just don't even, people do all kinds of stuff, so don't even think about that. But apparently, even though there'd been 2 decapitated women less than a mile away from her house a few months earlier, her daughter brings her a machete and she puts it in the attic. And it stayed there.
You'll recall that Castell said he had looked at the hacked neck of a sweater that was lying on his desk and could tell without a doubt that it was a hatchet. But Hall wasn't so sure. Could perhaps multiple slashes from a machete end up looking like hatchet marks?
So he came up here and met the woman and got the machete and then took that back and had it tested for blood and so forth to see if there's anything. Now, the machete was sitting under water that was running down in a stream for several months before the girl even found it. So anyway, the test for blood came up negative. They took it all apart. They checked the screws and all the holes and everything like that, and it was negative for blood.
After retrieving the machete, Hall thought it was possible, maybe not likely, but possible, that if by chance the machete had been used to kill Merritt and Karen, that their heads might be in that same culvert it had been found in. So a fire truck was used to spray high-pressure water through the culvert. Jeff, Hall, and a cold case detective stood at the other end as the water came through, looking for skull fragments. They found nothing.
So after we're done looking for the skulls, Richard says, well, I got to talk to this guy, the guy named Lynch that called me. And so we went to talk to him, and he lived in the Weird Mine area. And he was maybe in his 60s, nice guy. But he said that he had a guy that Richard ought to look into, a guy named Bird. And, well, why do you think we should look into him? And Lynch said, well, I used to go down his farm and get eggs for my folks and every week or two. And they used to forbid me, they wouldn't let me go down there when he was the only one there because they were nervous about him. Well, why were they nervous? Well, there were just lots of rumors around the neighborhood that somebody was setting fires and, so there was talk that it was him, and then that he was torturing animals. And that's when I spoke up and said, what do you mean torturing animals? Because, it's a big range. What's torture? And he said he used to pull the legs off cats. And that, to me, that was a big red flag. Still, it's only about 3 p.m, and he goes, let's go talk to Bird. And I said, okay. this guy's apartment, and he's in a wheelchair, but it's not clear why. He's got very dark hair, and when we walk up to the place, his door's open a little bit, and we can see him talking on the phone. We can just see him from behind. And he's a pretty big guy, and he's got dark hair. So when he saw us, and he just kind of waves us in, and
So he sees you through the crack of the door?
yeah. He was probably an inch or two taller than Richard. I mean, you can't tell in a wheelchair, but he was bigger than me for sure, and probably a couple inches taller than Richard.
So he still came across as pretty sturdy.
Yeah, he was kind of overweight, but it had the overweight of an athlete who's now 75 years old, rather than like overweight of a guy who's always been heavy for his whole life. And so Richard does his avuncular thing and, holds out his retired policeman badge, but I think his thumb might have been over the word retired. Richard had a question that he had asked several people, and I got the impression that it was something he asked pretty much everyone, which was, yeah, we're looking in an old murder case, and the guy goes, the Coeds? And so that was odd, we thought. So, yeah, well, we were just looking in, and we know that you used to live down in a Weird Mine area and that you might know somebody around there. Do you know anyone we could look into about that? And he said, I don't know nothing about that. It was in all the papers. He goes, yeah, I know what was in the papers. That's all he knows. And I'm thinking, come on, the Weird Mine section's small. There's 2 decapitated bodies. Everybody was talking about it. So, that can't be true that you never talked to anyone about it. But this answer was interesting too. Everyone who had been, in my presence at least, asked about, do you know anyone who might have done it? Do you know? People almost always try to come up with a name, or they say, oh yeah, I always heard it was blah, blah, blah. He just started naming people. He must have named a dozen people. But boom, boom, boom. And to me, it was kind of shocking and thinking, there were either a lot of very creepy people in the Weird Mine section, or he's trying to distract us, I thought, or...
It was all just sort of a decoy.
That's what Richard thought, yeah. And that's what I thought, too. He was just trying to distract. So at some point, we get some preliminaries out. We're there a few minutes, and then Richard goes, well, Ronnie, I'm just wondering, what kind of car did you drive back then? And his whole demeanor changed. It was I've heard of this, how all the mood in the room changed 180 degrees or whatever. It was like that. Suddenly he was as if he was trying to be friendly and helpful, and then all of a sudden he got really cold and kind of scary, and he said, why do you want to know that? And Richard, trying to keep it light, says, oh, it's just, I'm just nosy, I guess. And Charlie said, that nosier is going to get you hurt. We're done. And we walk out in the hallway, and as we're walking toward the elevator, I say, that's our guy. And Richard goes, maybe.
That's all we have time for today. Next time, on the final episode of Married and Karen, we hear the chilling story of the man that Jeff believes killed the girls. Sarah isn't so sure. We explain the connection between his story and the hit show Mindhunter, and how this podcast has opened up Married and Karen's story to a new generation of students in the region. And we ask for your help in preserving the show. Jeff and Sarah's book about the Coed murders is nearing completion, and they'll soon be looking around for a publisher. If you know a publisher or anyone in the industry that you think might be interested, feel free to contact us at either the website or the Facebook page. Married and Karen is a passion project of Chromatic Media. As always, all episodes are free and without ads. Check our website at chromatic.media, that's KROMATIC.media for extras. Join the Married and Karen Facebook page for updates on the podcast and the case itself. And if you've been enjoying the show, take 2 seconds to rate it on your favorite podcasting service to help other listeners find good stuff. Special thanks to Valina Beatty and Vanessa Lawson for speaking to us this episode, and special thanks to Hoppy Kercheval for letting us use that audio of his show. Married and Karen is produced by myself and Sarah Gibbons with lots of assistance assistance from Jeff Fuller. Our theme song, which you can hear right now, and other instrumentals throughout the show are written and performed by John Smithers, Nick Larson, and Annie Stroud, who have started playing music around Morgantown under the band name The Others. Their tracks were produced by Nathan Snyder. As always, the rest of our music was written and recorded by Morgantown musicians. On this episode, we had The Fur with Ray Gun Love. Union Sound Treaty with Needle Fall Down.
Time of the evening, I pull out my gun, prepared for what's after. I pour something strong.
Beast Friend with River Rock.
Stones under our feet.
Hello June with Fight Don't Fight. We'll see you again soon with the show finale. Take care.